So, with all that said, why don't we discuss a little bit about what are some of the examples that come to mind about what isn't RV or what doesn't count as far as we're concerned?
All right, so I tried to think of my biggest bugbear, but actually I have at least two. So I think the worst thing has got to be when there's a complete lack of blinding, where people know exactly what topic they want to investigate, and then they just sit there and say stuff about it. And it's not to say that they're not perceiving psychically, but it's just that we have no idea whether they are. Where is that coming from? Is it coming from imagination, memory, desires? Where?
So, a telltale sign when somebody is not blinded is when they're self-tasking. So, in other words, when they say, last week I decided to task myself on this one thing, and then they go and view it subsequently. And it's very obvious, but it's definitely something to look out for when people are their own taskers.
And I think it's important to also add a note here that you can still get accurate psychic information through self-tasking. And I've done this. I used to do this actually quite a bit for clients where they'd tell me exactly what they wanted to know. I would use different psychical techniques, even the remote viewing methods that I learned. Now I knew what it was, so it wasn't remote viewing, but I still used the same steps. But I knew exactly what the question was and what they were after. And in that work, I got very useful information for my clients that I couldn't have known about them. So that was an interesting feedback thing I got later on. That then also I'd get calls or emails a year later saying that they took the advice that I gave them and it worked out splendidly for them. They made a lot of money or they made a career change that really worked out for them and they're happier. So I think it's important to say that psychical functioning and being a traditional psychic is still a real phenomenon and you can get really good information. Difference, though, is that when you are blind, that is what remote viewing is. If you're a traditional psychic out there, I don't want you to feel like we're putting you down. In fact, I do quite a bit of that stuff. But when we're talking about the Cypher podcast, it's important to say that this is what it is versus this is what it is not.
So another type of psychic phenomenon that wouldn't be considered remote viewing, but that can actually be considered psychic phenomenon is spontaneous experiences. I think a lot of people can relate to having dreams that are premonitions or dreams that are precognitive. In other words, you dreamed about something happening and either the following day or shortly thereafter, it actually does take place. That's a form of spontaneous precognition or spontaneous psychic experiencing. However, it is not remote viewing because it has no directed target. It has no deliberate approach. And I think that's another characteristic that we're looking at when we are looking at remote viewing is that there is a deliberate intention to investigate a particular thing. It's not just random and it's not just whatever feels like coming in at the given time.
It's why you never would ask a remote viewer, how come you didn't see this event that was really big that just happened? I thought you were a psychic. And it's because that's not what remote viewing is. Remote viewers only look at the specific task that they've been given by their project manager, period. They don't go outside those bounds. Anything else is just traditional psychic work.
Yeah, absolutely. If you asked me, how come you didn't see this coming? And like, you didn't ask. Simple as that. And it's not that we can't have accurate premonitions in dreams and spontaneous bilocations and weird things that happen in meditation. These are all interesting, legit phenomena, which are sometimes also anomalous information transfer. They're cool things. I practice this stuff just like Brett and just like Emily. But I draw the line and I will say it's not really remote viewing or caveat it and say I wasn't completely blind or I was front-loaded like this, or I'm not going to take the term remote viewing and use it to legitimize or add extra weight to something which isn't.
And I think that's actually one of the key variables here. It's how much weight are we giving the work? When I do a proper remote viewing session for a project manager, I don't know what it is. I go through the steps, I get feedback, etc. That work historically has proven to be far more accurate and far more useful than just open-ended, spontaneous psychic functioning. And it makes sense why, because I don't have all my biases. I don't have all of these super front-loaded ideas. I don't have all the things I've read about whatever the task might be. Or even if I did some psychic work for a client, they're explaining their life to me about here's the thing that I'd like to improve. I want to change careers. I don't know how to do it. And so all of that is front loading. I know everything about this client and what the client wants to know. And that's important for me. on doing that work because I would want to make sure they're getting the information that they're after. Now, if I wanted to use remote viewing for this, I would need to have somebody else take all that information for me and then task me on that without knowing anything about who the client is. And a lot of people do that. But I tend to give more weight to the remote viewing work because all of my biases are out the window. They're not present when I'm collecting this information. And so it's a more clean set of data, whereas the other more psychical information is typically more noisy. And one of the effects that often happens is if you can have a really gifted natural psychic, say you bring that person into a crime scene, and they may get there and have all of these wonderful, highly accurate, detailed pieces of information at the scene. Oh, there was a person here. They were interacting with somebody else. And then they went down into a red truck and they drove off on towards the freeway, Highway 101. One of the things that actually happens to traditional psychics, though, is they don't know when they've lost the signal of accurate information. And this is one of the things that the technique of remote viewing actually solved for or helps address is when you lose signal. How do you deal with the additional noise that comes in? And part of the methodology that is taught, there are steps that help you avoid that and minimize that. So really what it's doing is just increasing your signal to noise ratio.
Lastly, on the topic of things that aren't RV, I think there's one other big area that we should touch on. And this one's a bit of a gray zone, but ultimately, I think that if you're looking at targets that are what we call not feedbackable, or targets that you can't ever get any feedback on whatsoever, it's challenging to know whether you're really remote viewing. Now, when we do all of our topics for Cypher Podcast, I always try to create the task such that there is some sort of a grounding that is feedbackable. And initially, when I assign the tasks to both Brett and David, I'm always looking for, in the initial session work that they do, can I tie this back to something I know for sure exists at the site in order to determine if they're actually on target?
And I would actually argue that if there is no feedback for a task, there's nothing that you get as to see whether or not the viewer is at the site or is on the target because there's some known information. I would argue that you're actually not remote viewing at all because you need feedback. If there is no feedback, what you're doing is going to be purely psychical work. And it may be right, could be correct, but there's zero way for you to know. If I remote view, go to another galaxy and describe the civilization on the largest planet to this star, and I get all this information and detailed work, that's not remote viewing. I have to temper that a little bit. Maybe I describe the solar system and the star correctly, and I describe the orientation of the planets. Maybe now I have some feedback and I can make a decent guess about what went on. But there are things you can remote view. I'm putting air quotes on this remote view that when they have zero feedback, I don't think that's remote viewing anymore. I think what you're doing is something different.
So there's actually a classic example of this, Brett, where actually initially when the viewing happened, there was no feedback, but then feedback became available. And that is when Ingo Swann famously remote viewed Jupiter. And he said that there were rings around Jupiter. And this was at a time when there wasn't actually any space probe or telescope that could get out that far to see what's really going on Jupiter. We obviously knew it was a planet and we could vaguely see it. But it turns out once the space probe got to Jupiter, there was indeed a ring. And so there was subsequent feedback much after the original viewing had occurred.
The interesting thing about that story, though, is they knew in advance that they would get feedback. It was just delayed. So even in the setup for that project on Jupiter, they knew that the spacecraft was going to reach there and they'd know whether or not he was correct in a few months or not. So that's why I think that still matches. But if I remote view who made reality, I could do it. I could get information, but I'm never going to get feedback for that. So it may be a useful story that comes out of it, but to say that this is factually true, I think is a slight misuse of the skill. It may create an interesting story, but it's not necessarily something you can hang your hat on as being factually accurate.
I think when you have targets that are so ungrounded that there's no chain of custody, no ground truth, nothing, they're actually those sorts of targets who created reality. Or we did our Thoth episode, right? We talked to something, we don't know if it exists. If it does, we don't know whether there's one of it or many of it or what it is. And it told us really interesting stuff. It was really fun and we would totally do it again. But that kind of thing is really getting into the realms of mysticism, right? We're exploring the greater mind at that point. We're not doing operational intelligence gathering work. We're just going out for jolly into the universal consciousness or something. It's a different thing. And it's what we're trying to avoid doing with the mysteries that we're looking at for this show. Apart from Thoth, because Thoth was cool.
I just want to make this distinction for the listener. We're not saying that we will never do non-feedbackable targets on Cypher Podcast. Occasionally we do, but on the topics that we cover for famous mysteries or famous unsolved events in the past, we always do try to have some sort of a grounding in our tasking and in our remote viewing work, because that's what we feel is our value add to you as the listener. In our show, we are able to help you navigate some of these esoteric topics and lore on the internet about a particular thing while bringing it back to grounded reality. What do we know for sure about this? Adding our own personal RV data into that and then jumping out into the realm of speculation. Although occasionally we will have shows where we just purely speculate, like with Thoth, where it's an interesting story, but it should just be taken as such. It's an interesting story that we'll never really get any type of feedback on.
So Thoth is an interesting one because there was some feedback associated with it, but it's super borderline because in the work I described, I'm talking with an Egyptian god. He lived a long time ago. So hypothetically, you could argue that makes sense based on the known story. I described the actual idea of Thoth, which matches some of the information from Egypt. But other than that, it's really just a story. And when we're talking about these really esoteric things, I think it's a fascinating story. It's often a useful story, but it's just another lens. And so this is why any of these esoteric and these mysteries topics, I think they're fun, but don't take them as 100% ground truth. I would never argue or never encourage anyone to view them that way. They're just another lens to look at it.
Yeah, not only are they stories, but they're also very subjective, right? These are more like mystical experiences that we had and we are sharing with you because it's interesting and it's fun. And I'm sure we'll have another episode one day about epistemology and the nature of awareness and how that relates to feedback in remote viewing, because the idea that we even have a good handle on what's going on around us in reality is suspect. We're doing our best.
As we discussed in our first show, and trying to explain to the listener that you should apply your own level of discernment to everything you hear, and that includes what you hear on our show. You may find that some of the topics we cover, some of the data we uncover within those topics really resonates with you, but you may find that it really challenges some of your views.
Some of the data that we've got on our projects has challenged my views, and I've been like, what? What is in Mars? What? Actually, that wasn't the worst one. I think the worst one was Skinwalker. That I found really like outside of my boggle threshold, what we found there. And it's like, that's what the data says. And it leads on to this question of, does the fact that the viewer got feedbackable data, the way you can match it with the ground truth of the target, does that somehow validate the unverifiable data they get? If I draw a perfect sketch map of Skinwalker Ranch and I say, oh, here's the area and this is what's happening, and here's a huge, massive pile of woo, does the fact that I drew an accurate Skinwalker Ranch mean that the woo-woo is true too? Because I would say it doesn't.
That's a really good point, David, because I think there's a lot of people that look at remote viewing and they say, okay, we do have this ground truth that is feedbackable. We're anchoring to that, and then we're presupposing that everything else we discover at this target that isn't feedbackable is 100% true. There's a lot of people who believe that. And I just want to encourage the listener to take everything that isn't feedbackable with a big grain of salt. It's possibly true. It may be better than random, but certainly not something that you should be certain about. It's important to be uncertain and to be okay with, this might be true. I don't really know.
I think the way that I look at it is if I have a session that is describing the knowns really precisely, and then I have something else there that is the unknown, and I have equally descriptive summaries of this as well, that I'm going to take that unknown information bit more seriously than had I not gotten the knowns as well. So I think it lends some credit. But the question, and this is going to be up to any individual, how much credit should it be given? And for me, it's really on an evolving scale, using my own intuition on how much I should take, how seriously I should take it. But it's more than, like you said, Emily, it's more than random chance, I think. It doesn't mean it's 100% true, but I think that it's true enough that it's worth thinking about seriously and integrating into your thoughts about a topic. It may not be totally accurate, but it could be, and therefore it's worth thinking about. That's around how I try and evaluate what remote viewing data that's been obtained blindly, that has feedback with known factors involved.
I like to keep beliefs in superposition. They're neither true nor false. They're just another angle on it. It's Schrodinger's opinion. Going back to that idea of credit, I think having really well described ground truth in a blind session, maybe that can lend some credence to the unverifiable, unknown stuff that you reported to. But I think turning that on its head a little, the idea that if you fail to describe that stuff, then what we would say is you're off target, you missed. So I don't care if you told me this amazing woo story. If there's nothing to indicate that you've made any contact with the target and this doesn't make sense, then you're just wrong, you're off. And that's happened, I think, once, twice. It's happened a couple of times with doing sessions for the podcast, where what I've got back is just, no, this is useless. Do it again, or we'll do something else. Or like when I described molecules coming into existence, for example, it's just, no, this doesn't tell us anything about what we wanted to know. So it's going in the bin and we're not going to use it.
One of my jobs as a tasker is to look at the initial session data that comes back from both Brett and David and to try to ascertain, okay, have they really hit the mark? Or if they haven't, where have they gone off the rails? And I'm usually pretty good at narrowing it down to, okay, here they've just not got any site data. And there have been occasions where I've just said, start again. Let's ignore your previous session and just redo the task from scratch because you're completely off the mark. Now, I'm curious, David or Brett, do you have a sense of why and when you get off the mark? Is it just you've had a bad day? Or is it perhaps your approach to the target? Do you have any common patterns that you've noticed?
I think that's a multivariable thing. I think it could be as a result of not getting enough sleep. It could be a result of working too many sessions. It could be a mindset issue. It could be unknowns that we aren't even aware of right now. I think really all we can do to answer that is to guess. Actually, it could even be a skill issue where some people early on, they just miss nonstop or their data is so noisy and it's because they haven't practiced enough. So to point it at one thing in particular, I don't think we really can do, but certainly having a good diet, both mentally and physically, and being in shape, and this is a mind-body skill, is an important thing. Lack of sleep doesn't help.
I would say a thing that I've noticed for me, which is really important, is emotional state. If I'm worried about something, if I've got a worry niggling away, I need to put that to one side before I do my remote viewing. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. I just can't quiet my mind down enough to hear the data, I suppose. And there's a great exercise for that, which is on Laurie Williams's website called the Set Aside exercise, which I think is quite similar to some of the stuff out of the Monroe Institute as well, which is a super simple thing. And once you've practiced it, you can make it even quicker to just put aside your worries before you do your session. That's probably the best low-hanging fruit quick win for improving accuracy that I could suggest to people.
It turns out that's actually a really useful life skill for those who are finding their life being very disorganized. This is coming out of David Allen's Getting Things Done book as well, where he talks about you need to brain dump. If you have ideas in your mind that your mind is trying to hold on to, you need to get this out onto some sort of a system on paper, a computer platform, where you just record all your thoughts and ideas so that you can free up your mind to have good thinking or even to do remote viewing work. So it's just a general good life tip on how to be more focused in what you're doing, even if you're not doing remote viewing specifically. So another aspect of remote viewing is the temporal aspect, meaning, are we looking at a target that's in the future, in the present, or in the past? And is there a difference between these three or perceived three different time periods? I personally think there is. I think that there's a huge difference between future events and present and past events, and we can maybe speculate as to why. But for whatever reason, it seems like we end up with different levels of accuracy, whether or not we're looking at the future or things that have already happened. It's almost like if it's happened or happening, it's resolved to a particular outcome, at least on our perceived timeline that we're living in. And the future may have some other options or activities going on with it. Brett, do you want to share your thoughts on what you think is happening? Because I know you've done a lot of both past and future viewing.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on the time quandary as far as why is it that remote viewing things in the past is easier than the future? It seems logical, but the future, I think there are two different elements that are at play. The first one is, in a simplistic analogy, if you're trying to forecast what I'm going to have for dinner, and I'm telling you I'm going to go buy the food at the store, can you tell what I'm going to have for dinner? The grocery store might have thousands upon thousands of options, and therefore it's very difficult for you to ascertain what that outcome will be with any high degree of certainty. But if I happen to be going into a store where they sell 95% of their products are canned beans, then you can pretty clearly get the idea that I'm going to have canned beans for dinner. And so it's like a likelihood or probability of the outcome may very well be what remote viewing is actually tuning into. And so it's like the unconscious mind, the part of you that's giving you the information, is giving you the highest likelihood of what it thinks from its perspective is going to happen. It doesn't mean that's going to happen. And it's why I've never seen anyone who has had a 100% hit rate on forecasting the future. But that, I believe, is potentially one of the things that's at play, is that the future is probabilistic. And I have another point on this, but I think that this is a key central role of it.
There is also the role of emotion in future predictions. There's this phenomena, and it happens time and time again, that remote viewers make very dire predictions for the future. Oh, it's going to be nuclear apocalypse and these terrible things will happen. And very often they either don't happen or they happen in a much less dramatic fashion than was predicted. It seems because those things are frightening, those are threats that we would want to avoid, we maybe zoom in on them and focus on them. That's how we perceive reality, right? If you're walking along the street, you ignore almost everything around you. But if there's suddenly a tiger running towards you, your attention is going to be absolutely locked onto that. And you're going to be thinking about that and nothing else. So a lot of what exists out there in psychic space, for want of a better term, isn't going to happen, or isn't real, or is an idea, or is somebody else's fear, or is a collective fear. And as remote viewers, we can describe that stuff, I think, just as much as we can describe ground truth. So if you're making future predictions, and Brett, your example of beans, I was literally about to say, I have done the dinner prediction thing as a bit of a joke a while ago. And somebody said, all right, go and remote view my wife and tell me what she's going to make for dinner. So I did, and I said, beans. And sure enough, it was beans. Interestingly, I got the type of beans wrong, but I did get the beans.
See, that's the probability of chances. The probability is it baked beans or something else?
Actually, I would say it was conceptual. The concept was beans, and then I perceived a certain type of beans because when you say the word beans to me, my mind creates a particular image as its default bean until you add some more detail. And I think because this was a 5-second thing just done for fun, I didn't dig into the nature of the beans.
Well, it's using your vocabulary, right? And that's what remote viewing and all of psychical functioning is going to use. It's going to use what's available. It's your pattern matching system. It's going to do that. But so this is the probabilistic side of things. I think there's another element, the way I look at this, is that there's also bigger things, I think, at play that are a part of reality that perhaps are not so probabilistic. And I can give one example of this. In 2019, I was given a tasking by a client of mine to see what is going to happen over the next 4 months with a particular part of the financial sector. And when I looked at it, I saw a massive correction occurring at a very specific price point and on a very specific date. It was like either going to be amazingly accurate or amazingly incorrect. And this was 4 months out. And as time went by, it got closer and closer, and eventually it played out exactly as I had forecasted. And it made me think about that in retrospect after it occurred. How could I have gotten such a specific detail if that wasn't already agreed upon in advance that this is what the future would hold? And so part of me thinks that there are these really large events that exist in time. They're like these big mountains on the horizon that you can see from a far off distance. And you go, oh, yeah, that may be really far away, but it's so big. It has such a big impact on reality or people or conscious awareness that it's much more visible as something that's going to occur. Whereas our everyday life stuff, maybe the probability is a little bit more sporadic. And that's what maybe makes it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult. So it's just a guess, but it's just part of my experience.
So I've seen there are remote viewers that publish their work online, and many of them like to do future predictions. So what they'll do is they'll say, oh, I'm going to look at next month's news headlines and I'm going to predict what's going to happen in the news. And inevitably, it ends up being something like an explosion or a ship sinking. And then the month later, they'll go back and say, see, there was an explosion and there was a ship sinking. What do you guys think about these predictions? I think that in hindsight, you can almost plant any type of a prediction into whatever actually occurred. Because in the world, every month there's an explosion or a ship sinking. I know it's a silly example, but what are your thoughts on this?
I think if you want to do that kind of prediction for about half the year, you can predict landslide in the Philippines, and you're right more than 50% of the time. So yeah, we need specifics. And that's another thing. It is quite tricky to get proper nouns with remote viewing. Mantra, if you like, is describe, don't name. Because once we name things, we're applying our own labels and assumptions that are attached to those labels about things. We don't want to say it's a fish. We want to say it's scaly, it's slippery, it's stinky, it's wet, which may seem a bit convoluted, but it helps keep the data clean. So we can say there's land, it's wet, it's heavy, it's moving quickly, it's not supposed to, people are getting hurt, we don't like it, this is bad, it's dark, it's rainy. We can say things like that, but then to name the country is actually, it's a very different skill from describing physical sensory stuff that's going on. So if you're going to make more generic descriptions about things which happen all the time, then I think you need to report really specific things about those. Otherwise, it's boring, and not suggesting people are making it up, but it's just not interesting to say, there will be a ship sinking next month. What else is going to happen? It will rain in the UK. Really?
I'm a little mixed on this type of application for remote viewing because I have seen some work out there that's used this type of tasking, and it's gotten really detailed descriptions of events that are very nuanced, that just pulling it out of a bin randomly, I don't believe would be possible because it had such high level of detail with it that I would say, yep, psychical functioning definitely occurred there. Here's the evidence. At the same time, there's also a lot of remote viewing data out there as well, where it doesn't have that type of specificity. And it does feel like they're just being very generic in their work, and they're just pattern matching. Hey, it's a big world out there and you're predicting what's going to happen in the future. You could come up with just about anything and find it in the world and then say, aha, I've done it. And I'm not impressed by that so much, which is also why I don't do that type of work. The type of forecasting that I've done historically has been, it's either really right or it's going to be really wrong. For example, in the stock market, is the stock market going to go up or is the stock market going to go down? It's clear cut. I'm not searching the internet to find my feedback. And I think when you do that with remote viewing, it's a trap. And unless you use a very high level of skepticism with your work, I think you're going to fall into it.
So what you're describing, Brett, reminds me a little bit about what scientists would do in the scientific method. Is you want to have a hypothesis that is falsifiable. In other words, you want to have the potential that your thing is going to be wrong. And if you don't have that risk of it being wrong, it's not that useful, right? If the end result is whatever I'm going to view of next month is going to happen anyway somewhere, and I can always try and fit the facts into my prediction, it's not a very useful prediction, and it's probably not even a prediction. It's just trying to game the system.
Yeah, it's a trick. It may come off as a trick to a lot of people. And ultimately, at the end of the day, was it really useful? That's also why I don't do it, is I don't see any value in figuring out a boat's going to sink off the coast of somewhere in the world. How is that useful to me? What's useful to me is figuring out what David's going to have for lunch tomorrow. No, just kidding. That's not useful either. So
That's easy. Coffee.
yeah. Ultimately, at the end of the day, people can choose whatever they want to look at with remote viewing. I'm much more interested, we're more interested with this podcast at looking at exciting, sexy, esoteric topics of Thoth and ancient Egypt and off-planet stuff. They're just fun. They're fun stories. And we're not saying that this is 100% factual. We're admitting that up front. We're being honest with that. But they're still interesting, and there may be some truth that is in there. And I think it's worthwhile to take a look at the lens because it's being remote viewed under blind circumstances. But remote viewing the month in advance, I know a lot of people do it and like it, and that's fine. It's just not for me.
While we're on the topic of looking at the future, we've been getting into how we remote view the future. I'm curious to know, Brett and David, what are your thoughts on our ability to influence the future? If we look at the future, can we actually change something? Say we see, for example, that we might have a car crash next week. Can we do things to avoid that car crash? Or can we even create positive influences or manifestations in our lives? Like we want to have a particular outcome happen instead of not having an outcome happen. Maybe we want to have a date with that individual, which is an interesting example because it affects their free will. Or maybe we want to have a lottery winning, which affects maybe the free will of lots of people who don't win the lottery. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Lottery is a can of worms, which I'm going to leave firmly closed for this episode. But in terms of affecting the future, there's potentially time loops or paradoxes here. So one way that you can affect the future is by predicting it. In the military unit, they would, and actually with TDS was doing this allegedly as well in the civilian sector, where for government clients, they were predicting terrorist attacks. Where's it going to be? What's going to happen? So they would supply the information to the FBI or whoever it was, and they would go in their van, their Flowers by Irene van or whatever, and sit next to the stadium and wait for the guy to turn up and then just arrest him. So they've changed the future there. This also happened when they were experimenting with silver futures. The idea is they describe the correct target so they can predict the silver futures. They win, and then they're taken to this location, and that is their feedback as part of the protocol. So what happens is they describe the location that they're going to be taken to correctly. They win a bunch of money, and then they say, we can't be bothered to go there. We don't need to. We won the money. We're not going. So now the timeline has changed. They're no longer going to go to the place where they would receive the information that they described in order to correctly predict silver futures. They described it, they were right, but they're not there.
So, David, it's interesting that there are people out there that actually believe that remote viewing is something that can only happen through the eyes of perhaps yourself or another conscious being. So if you get into this idea of reincarnation, where we've all been alive forever across all the different locations, we're just really viewing what our past self saw or what our future self saw. There's other people who think, well, there has to be a conscious being present for there to be any type of viewing at all. There's others who think that it's all consciousness anyway, so what does it matter? But these questions get really murky because we don't even have the correct language to talk about some of these things. All of our language is centered around linear time, is centered around I, me, myself, you, yourself, everyone's different, or are we all the same? We don't really know the answers to any of these questions. And I think that even in English, but other languages, the words are just impotent to describe what's really going on. There's so much more going on than we can really wrap our heads around.
Yeah, there's a rather popular idea that's been floating around the remote viewing community on this idea of time loops. The supposition is that remote viewing is a result of somehow gaining access to a future memory after you've already seen your feedback. And personally, I find that explanation a little ridiculous, and it's actually very easy to disprove, which I've done on several instances for interested parties. And the simple way to disprove that is I have an individual or a tasker give me a photograph that they never intend to show me, ever. And so I will never have a future memory of what's in that photograph. And then I run the session. And if my session data matches the photograph, then the judge and the tasker goes, okay, this seems to match. And then they just destroy the photo and they never show it to me. Suddenly now I have an example of remote viewing working where I have no future memory of the feedback. And so unless I'm telepathically pulling the photo out of the tasker's head, in which case you're just adding more complexity to something, and it's just, I don't think that adds up. It's not a sufficient explanation for what's going on with remote viewing, in my opinion.
So interestingly enough, Brett, in that example, what if they, or do they actually tell you, yes, you got the photo correct? In other words, they do give you some level of feedback in that it's yes or no. And in the cases where you got a yes, you didn't actually get feedback as to what the photo was, but you got feedback as to that it was correct. So it is a form of feedback, is it not?
No, I don't think it is, because if my feedback is I'm describing a polar bear on an ice cap and he's putting his claw down in the water and grabbing a fish or swatting at a seal, where's my future memory of ever seeing the photograph? There's a broken chain there. And I've actually done both, though. I've actually done one where I was told, yes, you hit the target, and then did another one where I wasn't actually given any response. They want to test that as well. I assume that it did fine because they kept employing me on other projects, but they never actually gave me direct feedback. So maybe you could say that's a form of feedback, but I just don't think it's a very good explanation for feedback in the remote viewing process. I think it's something else going on.
Yeah, I agree with you, but without getting too metaphysical, I think I want to go back to this idea about there being a conscious observer of what we're remote viewing at some point, or maybe everything is consciousness and so that's okay. But the fact of the matter is that we can't verify at the moment that remote viewing has taken place if there's no conscious observer. Because if nobody's ever seen the feedback, how do we know it's correct? Somebody could task you something, they never tell you whether you hit the target, but they saw it, right? Or people in the distant past experienced something. There's always, whenever there's ground truth and chain of custody, there's a conscious observer. So it's not so much that we can say there has to be this, it's that we can't look outside of that space. We can't examine that problem space at the moment. But now I think that this is a really exciting time in remote viewing because of the improvements in machine learning technology, where soon a computer will be able to task you and judge your session. And all of that information will exist only inside some computer memory somewhere. It will never leave that, and then it will be destroyed. And there will be, what are we doing then? Are we reading the mind of the computer? That doesn't make sense. I'm so excited for that.
It is a really exciting time for that. It's something that I've been personally working towards, is building a system and working with developers to build a system that is using machine learning to be able to judge a remote viewer session just as well as another human can judge a remote viewing session, and then be able to give feedback on whether not you hit the task or not. We can actually take the entire tasking process and judging process of remote viewing in the near future, setting up a task, picking a task, looking at the remote viewing work, determining whether the remote viewing work was correct or not in relationship to the original task, and then giving an output score of you did a good thumbs up, thumbs down. And all of that will take place without any conscious being or any observer creating that task. And it will be just as good, if not better, than a human doing it in the first place. That is coming in the very near future. It's actually a project that has been in the works for more than a year now on building this system. And I'm very excited about it because I think it's going to unlock and potentially answer a new question that has never been asked. Can we remote view something that has never been seen by human eyes as far as the task? I think we will, but it's going to pose a very interesting question once we do it.
Yeah, whatever the outcome is, it's going to be fascinating, isn't it? This is groundbreaking to be able to do this with no conscious observer at all. It's so cool because it might be that it won't work. I'm with you. I think it's going to work fine. I don't think there's limitations on remote viewing in that way. But if it doesn't work, it's going to tell us something super interesting too.
So speaking of limitations, I think this is a good opportunity to tie our conversation back to some more grounded topics, and that is, how does remote viewing and all of the things we do square with the scientific method? How does it seems like it should be woo, and yet the approach I think that all three of us take is that it's a real phenomenon. It's just as real as Newtonian physics or as anything else you can explore through science. And yet it seems to elude science. It seems to be beyond science. And I think it's important for us to discuss what are the limitations of the scientific method. Science is not an institution or a person, despite what some would have you believe. It's a methodology, and all methodologies are useful tools to find out what's going on in our reality. But these tools, just like remote viewing, has its limitations. The scientific method itself has limitations. So I'm curious, Brett, do you have any thoughts on how the scientific method is both limited and how it can feed into what we know about remote viewing?
You have two thoughts on that. My first thought is that remote viewing was actually designed and created by scientists that were interested in trying to understand consciousness and non-local awareness. So it's a funny thing. It doesn't come out of some ancient tradition. Now, I'm sure the psychics they used would argue maybe slightly differently, but the scientists probably at the laboratory would say, no, it's none of that. And history will have to sort out the truth of the matter down the road. But I think that there is a key thing in scientific experimentation that is largely ignored by most of academia, which shouldn't be, which is the placebo effect. Is that you run experiments and different trials, and then the scientists say, okay, well, all of this that has to do with the placebo, we're just going to ignore that and throw that out the window because weird. And then let's only look at this other data over here that is outside the placebo effect. And I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong on this, I haven't looked this up in advance, but I do remember reading that placebo effect is, especially in like health and in healing, that it's actually one of the most powerful healing agents on the planet is the placebo effect. If someone believes that if they take the sugar pill, it will heal them, and then they get better, that happens way more often than chance should allow, like tremendously more than chance should allow. And so what's really going on there? I don't know, but it seems like people who are using the scientific method don't seem to care or want to find out, or at least a lot of them don't. And I don't think it's the method that's the problem. I think it's the scientists and academia that's the problem.
I think for medical drug trials, the placebo effect is actually the baseline. So it's assumed that the placebo effect will work. And then when they look at a drug's efficacy, is it better than placebo? Interestingly enough, some drugs are worse than placebo, but the fact that placebo works at all is just glossed over completely. They're like, well, of course, placebo is a thing. The interesting bit is why our particular drug is slightly better than placebo. If you can get the effect without even taking the drug and risking all the side effects, maybe that's a more interesting thing to be studying. But I think a lot of scientists don't even know how to approach it because the scientific method itself is limited in terms of its ability to explore consciousness. We actually need better tools to explore consciousness and consciousness phenomenon because it's not something you can bring into a laboratory and put under a microscope.
Yeah, because the consciousness phenomenon is generating the laboratory and the microscope and science and the scientists and the questions that are being investigated. Like a model of understanding cannot understand itself from the outside. It can only look inside within the things that it's drawn a line around. I think another issue is materialist dogma and bullying and people being put down in academia for going, wait a minute, our models don't work, but the alternative is so unfashionable that I'm just not going to talk about it. There is some interesting work that's been done on the placebo effect, which I believe it's understood that it's getting stronger over time in the results from the clinical trials, but only in the US for some reason. And larger placebos work better, and more expensive placebos work better. And placebos work even if you tell the patient that it's a placebo. So those first two studies would suggest that belief is important, right? If this drug costs more, if this placebo costs more, it's going to be better, right? But then if you tell the patient that it's a placebo and it works anyway, what is that telling us about the phenomena? There's something really strange going on here.
There's something that actually occurred in the laboratory at Stanford Research Institute that when skeptics, extreme skeptics, were brought into the laboratory, the remote viewing work actually got worse. And it's not because they were affecting the trial, but just their presence of being there reduced the psychical functioning that could be measured. It reduced it. And when they left, it returned. And so there's another weird phenomenon that occurs where if you bring in a bunch of people to the laboratory that say this is nonsense, that their belief somehow overrides or those who are trying to do it go into agreement with that for the time being to maybe make them feel more comfortable, to not break their reality box. It's a really interesting phenomenon that has been measured.
Brett, I think there's actually a term they coined as it relates to this. They called it the goats and the sheep. So the goats are like naysayers, and the sheep are the kind of the true believers. But it seems like the intentions of the people in the experiment are actually manifesting. So this is another phenomenon, is that there's actually manifestation going on. And it's very much akin to the saying, whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you are correct. In other words, if you believe you can't do something, you'll end up not doing it. And if you believe you can do something, you'll end up doing it. It's tying back to people's intentions actually manifest in the physical world.
Be careful. Science might prove that we're actually creating reality ourselves.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Everybody in there is projecting their own reality outwards from themselves rather than receiving one inwards, and they come into conflict, they water each other down. Or maybe not. So aside from the influence of the actual researchers and participants and goats who may be present, there's another effect which makes it difficult to study psi, which is the trickster effect. And I wonder whether this may actually be related to the goats ruining the psi experiments just by their extreme skepticism, right? Because especially with forced choice psi trials, where this is a thing like Xena cards or something where you're choosing from a preset menu of what will the outcome be. So you're not having to describe an unknown thing. You know it's going to be a wavy line or a square or a triangle or whatever, and you just have to pick one psychically. Experiments like that suffer this thing called the decline effect, where the people start off being able to do it really well, and the more they do it, the weaker the effect gets, and then eventually it just goes to nothing. And Dean Radin has done tons of work on this and just countless trials, and found that he wrote a paper called Tricking the Trickster, investigating this, and found that there's almost like a self-correcting aspect where at first you'll get very strong results and then they actually go negative, I think, and cancel themselves out. So it's almost like something is going, no, this result is too strong. This isn't allowed in reality. So now it's going to go the other way, and we'll have an anti-psi effect from multiple participants in these experiments. These are, I assume, college students, right? That's usually who's participating in these experiments. But these are not trained remote viewers or something. These are people here being told to guess the Xena card correctly and we'll give you lunch or something. It's not a complex setup, but it's replicated thousands and thousands of times. Once the evidence gets too strong, this effect kicks in. Now, if there was no effect, what you would expect to see would be just randomness. Consistently no effect. But that's not what you get. You get strong effect, and then you do it too much. And some effect appears and goes, nope, that's enough. That's too profound. That's going to mess things up too much. We, as a planet Earth, don't believe in this that much. And then it reverses and disappears. And it's a very interesting phenomena, which of course raises even more questions rather than providing answers. But that's why this subject area is so much fun.
I think that this is a good place to wrap up this episode of the Cypher Podcast. Thank you, everybody, for joining us as we took twists and turns down the road of what is remote viewing. If you like this episode, definitely share it with your friends. You can also find us on social media at Cypher Podcast. We'd love to hear from you and talk to our listeners, so find us on there. And so with that, we'll see you on our next episode. Take care, everybody.